listen to Andrew R. Creer. He's a professor of exercise science at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. He received degrees from Utah State University, Brigham Young University, and Ball State University. He's currently the department chair of exercise science and outdoor recreation at UVU. His topic today is the energetics of an expedition, what it took to fuel the core of discovery. And because he has specialized in exercise science, he took this interest in both Lewis and Clark and his specialty and combined it with his experience investigating ultra-endurance physiology and energy expenditures in places like Utah, Oregon, Arizona, France, and Spain. So we're going to see how he's applied this to the Lewis and Clark expedition. So without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Andrew.
Wow, thank you. And just want to say it's an honor to be speaking with you all. I'm an enthusiast at best, but probably more of a hobbyist when it comes to history and the Lewis and Clark expedition, yet I'm still fascinated. And so I'm hoping that we can focus more on the science and less on my knowledge of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but at the same time, I'm open to hearing your feedback and learning, benefiting from your expertise as well as we go. So let me start sharing my screen. The whole genesis of this talk, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's a giant stained glass mural on the campus of Utah Valley University, and they refer to it as the Roots of Knowledge. And basically, it's historical images in stained glass from the beginning up to current time, and so all of these important historical events are represented in stained glass. And there's a particular pane that is this image of Lewis and Clark, and so they have a speaker series that's based off of images in these panes. And when I saw that Lewis and Clark were in there, I just thought, wow, that would be an amazing topic. And it took me a little while to figure out how to approach it, but I finally figured it out. And I mentioned to somebody that I thought that would be cool. Well, that word got out, and then I got invited, and now here I am with you guys. But essentially, my thought was applying what we know now to energy expenditure during work, and kind of retrofit it to the expedition. And you're all familiar with the details. As far as the permanent members, I've seen from 33 to 34 in various things. Maybe you guys could help me clarify with that one. But basically, that's a lot of people to feed, including an infant and a dog. And to me, it's a miracle that they only lost one member of the party, and that had nothing to do with nutrition at all. So the fact that they were able to make this journey is pretty incredible. So just some terminology that I'll use, and this is actually a picture of a subject who's consuming something called doubly labeled water, which I'll talk about in a second. But basically, some of the tools that I was using, one of the big ones is basal metabolic rate, trying to predict what the members of the expedition would have, basically the calories they would have expended on a given day without really doing anything. So this is just the amount of calories they would expend to stay alive. So that's referred to as basal metabolic rate. And I've just used this equation to predict what the average basal metabolic rate would have been for the members of the permanent group. Then we have total energy expenditure. And so that refers to how many calories they would expend per day. So that's including their basal metabolic rate plus whatever calories they used for work that day. And so the total energy expenditure includes their work calories plus their basal metabolic rate. Then total energy intake would represent the amount of calories that they consumed. And the gold standard for determining total energy expenditure is what's referred to as doubly labeled water. So basically, you can see you've got isotopes on hydrogen and oxygen that once urine is collected, then you can take that urine and you can analyze it, and you can see where the hydrogen and the oxygen end up. And so from that, you can see water turnover based off the amount of labeled hydrogen that's in the urine. But then you can determine energy expenditure by seeing how much of that labeled oxygen ends up in carbon dioxide in the urine. And from that, then you can go back, because CO2 is a byproduct of metabolism. You can then go back and determine how many calories were actually expended during an activity. And so the data that I'll talk about referring to energy expenditure during activity is going to be based off data collected with this gold standard. And then finally, the last thing that I'll be including in my discussion is this physical activity level. And so this is just a way to simplify total energy expenditure based off of a person's metabolic rate. So instead of talking about thousands of calories per day, we can just talk about that as it relates to how many times above their basal metabolic rate did they work. So on average, the typical American has an office job, they might be at 1.5 times their basal metabolic rate. So they would have a physical activity level, or a PAL, of 1.5. Whereas someone who's running like a 100-mile ultramarathon, like the person pictured here, they're going to be well above 6 times their basal metabolic rate during that period. So we can use that to generalize some of these energy expenditures. I thought it was interesting. So I got this from one of the books, and I'll show you the books that I've used throughout this. But basically, this was recorded in Captain Lewis's journal regarding the men for the journey. Stout, healthy, unmarried men accustomed to the woods and capable of bearing bodily fatigue. And I believe I also read some of that in one of the We Proceeded On journal articles. I think, Jay, you may have been a co-author on that, talking about the sustenance diet, or whether as they're hunting and gathering, talking about how these men were likely accustomed to this type of work, which is why they specifically were looking for these men. They're accustomed to being hungry, seeking out their food, kind of hunting, gathering. And so men like that would be accustomed to the hardships of having to secure food as they go. So at this point, this is where I've taken some liberties, just because we don't have, at least not that I could find, we don't have actually actual weights on these men or heights. And so I've just had to try to investigate, okay, back in this period of time, what was the average weight of these frontiersmen? And the best I could find was a range of 130 to 180 pounds. And so I just split the difference and went with 150. Again, just complete prediction, but using that as an idea. And based off that, came up with a number of basal metabolic rate of around 1,700 calories a day. So that's what these men, without doing anything, would require just to function. And then from there, you have their basal metabolic rate, and then to figure out total energy expenditure, then you have to identify, okay, how many calories are they expending over the course of a day? And this varies by how hard they're working, what their tasks are. So a hard working day obviously is going to result in a greater caloric expenditure in addition to that basal metabolic rate than like a resting day. And so we have to predict light versus moderate to versus heavy activity days. And so from that point, I just went to a basic caloric expenditure chart, and you can find these charts. They're readily available online. Just identifying for different activities how many calories an individual would expend in an hour based off their body mass. And so I went through one of these lists and identified some of the activities that were in the list that I thought related to what members of the expedition would be doing. And so staying with our theme of around 150 pounds, you can see that vigorous paddling is pretty vigorous. I mean, 844 calories an hour, that's a pretty hard effort. I don't know if many of you mountain bike, but that's my primary hobby. And if that's a pretty tough mountain bike ride for me, 844 calories, and so that is vigorous. But I also understand that they may not always be doing that, and so sometimes if the waters were calmer and not as swift, maybe it was more of a moderate. Then you look at carrying heavy loads. It's funny because back then it was just part of life. Now people do it for fun and for exercise, and they call it rucking, and they do it for fitness. I grew up on a farm, and I've told my dad numbers of times if he's ever decided that he wants to be done, I keep telling him, you don't have to get rid of the farm. You just have to market it as farm fit, and people will pay you to come to the farm and do the work. And so I'm working on getting that copyrighted so nobody steal the farm fit. That's my thing. I'm just kidding. It's open to anybody. But you get the idea that it was part of life for these folks back then, and now people will actually pay to have the opportunity to do this type of thing, which is pretty wild. But anyway, so figuring that in, then just looking at the physical activity levels for these men, I've come to values of anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 calories on a typical day, and then upwards of 7,000 calories expended on vigorous days. And that's in addition to their basal metabolic rate. And so then we'd be looking at just typical days. anywhere from double their basal metabolic rate up to probably exceeding 5 times their metabolic rate on vigorous days. And so you can start to see, yeah, that becomes quite the math problem of securing enough calories for the people in the expedition to be able to consume and maintain mostly their ability to continue to work. It was, I don't know how much the expedition, how much thought they put into it from a logistical perspective outside of just trying to secure enough to feed everybody. But now, yeah, if I was planning on something like this, this is the information that I'd be using to try and calculate how much food that we'd need. It's impressive. So the next part I just wanted to highlight, and these are all studies that were done using doubly labeled water to assess energy expenditure in people doing these either expedition type things or very strenuous work bouts for periods of time. And so the first couple that you see up here, these were 2 individuals that did a 90-day Antarctic trek, and so they pulled their supplies behind them as they skied, and they reported values of 6.9 times their basal metabolic rate in one individual, and then 5.6 in the other. But those were during the very hardest points of that expedition. But when you look at the 90-day average, it drops down closer to about 4 times. But it gives you an idea that, yeah, there's still, even in things like this, there are periods where it's much more difficult and therefore requires more calories than other periods of time. The Tour de France requires energy levels over 5 times the athlete's basal metabolic rate. And so we know that can be sustained for at least 3 weeks. And then there's a variety of other things on here. So you can see some values from military operations where they measured energy expenditure using doubly labeled water. So right around that 2.5 to 3, maybe up to 4 if it's really intense, for a brief period of time, upwards of about 3 weeks. And then one of the closest things, so this is Brent Ruby. I mentioned him earlier with a group of you. He's a researcher up at the University of Montana that I collaborate with for some of my research. And he did a lot of his early energy expenditure work with wildland firefighters, which is probably typical as far as energy expenditure to a normal day of the men on the expedition. And so you're looking at anywhere from 2.5 to 2.8 times the basal metabolic rate on a typical fire day. So those are just some comparisons that I was looking at. But the higher the physical activity level, the shorter the duration of time that people can maintain that. And one of the biggest issues is just feeding that amount of effort. So some shorter duration examples. Here a couple of weeks ago, there was an event down in Arizona that goes from an area called Black Canyon up to Flagstaff. It's a 250-mile trail run called the Cocodona 250. Back in 2022, they had 5 individuals. They gave them this doubly labeled water. and then collected their urine throughout the race. And they were able to identify, on average, a value of about 5.4 times their basal metabolic rate when all 5 people were included. But this first one, this guy actually won the race that year, so just under 60 hours. And for that 60 hours, he sustained essentially a 7 times his basal metabolic rate. So he was expending nearly 13,000 calories per 24 hours during that event, which that's some heavy caloric expenditure. This figure here, this is from some data that I just recently published. That if any of you are interested, I made sure that we published it open access, and so I'd be happy to share the link with anybody who's interested. But basically, we had 2 runners that did a local trail race called the Wasatch 100, and in both cases, they were both very close to that 7. One of them was at 6.5 times his basal metabolic rate. The other one was over 7 times his basal metabolic rate. And in both cases, they actually ended up finishing about the same time, and they both expended about 16,000 total calories, which is wild. Me personally, the highest caloric output I've had in a single day during a single event is I used to race bikes on the road, like road racing. And there's an event that takes place between Logan and Jackson, Wyoming, and it's called the Logan to Jackson or Lodija. So it's about 200 miles. And I approached 10,000 calories one season or one year doing that. So then I look at this and think, 16,000 calories. That's a lot. Now if we come over here and take a look, this is a graph that I found, and what it is it's showing, so down here in the x-axis you have days, and on the y-axis it doesn't show up because the way the graph was constructed, but it's actually the physical activity level is over here. So time above, the basal metabolic rate level. Really having a hard time explaining that, but times above basal metabolic rate, basically. So this is their PAL. And so what you're seeing is for some of these longer things, like there's one right here. So that would be 0. This would be 1. This would be 2. This number right here was actually a race across the U.S., so on bikes. But I've also seen data from a man who ran around Australia, and that was his average was about 4 as well, and that was for a number of months, and so it seems like 4 is the activity level, and so that one was the race around Australia would have been up around here, but you can see that the higher the PAL, the harder it is to sustain for a long period of time. And then finally, you see this one down here, and so this represents pregnancy and lactation. And so when you think of Sakakawea, with an infant, so she would have been lactating, you can see that she was requiring a significant amount of calories. So not only were the men working, but then you had this young mother that was also nursing an infant. And so you can see just the number of calories that she was requiring on a day-to-day basis as well. So that sets me up to, as far as like, okay, so I've seen how much, or I've shown you how much energy people can expend for periods of time. So now I wanted to compare it with energy intakes, so reported intakes for these folks. And so we previously had talked about the Antarctic expedition and the Tour de France a little bit. We've talked about the Cocodona and the Wasatch. I mentioned that Australian race, the guy who ran around the perimeter of Australia. So you can see that was about 200 days, an average of 4 times the basal metabolic rate, which based off the athlete's mass, he was expending 6,300 calories per day, basically. We didn't get any energy intake data on, or there wasn't any energy intake data reported on that athlete. However, you can see his post-race mass, he only lost 1 kilogram over the course of that. And so it's probably safe to say that he was eating very close to what he was expending because there was minimal weight loss. And so that was pretty impressive that that athlete was able to eat nearly what he needed for that long a period of time. If you take a look at the Antarctic expeditions, you can see that one of the individuals lost 16 kilos. The other one lost 19 kilos. And it was reported on average they were eating 5,100 calories per day. And so in comparison to their PAL, you can see that over here, that was 3 times this individual's resting metabolic rate, and this amount for this individual was 2.7 times. But over the 90-day period, they averaged 3.4 and 4.1. So obviously, you can see the reason for the dramatic weight loss there is they were not eating nearly enough to replenish what they were burning on a day-to-day basis. In the Tour de France, the average physical activity level was 5.2, but they averaged consuming about 3.8 times their metabolic rate, resulting in some weight loss. The individual I showed you from the Cocodona 250, we don't know how much weight he lost, but we do know his intake per 24 hours wasn't near what his physical activity level was. And so the reason why I'm showing you this is it has been proposed that there is some sort of an alimentary limit that occurs around 2.5% of a person's basal metabolic rate, meaning that it's very difficult to eat large amounts even when people are expending large amounts. And so something that I just wanted to point out, and that can happen for a number of things. Fatigue. Sometimes people after a big effort, they just, even though their body needs calories, there isn't an appetite for some reason. And so fatigue can play a role in that. Obviously, food availability can play a role in that. However, when you take a look at these, especially competitions like the Tour de France and these ultra races, this Mudslinger 24, this was a 24-hour mountain bike race. Food was readily available for these individuals. Very easy to prepare, processed. much of it they're carrying with them. It's in little wrappers. They can pull it out. They can take off a lid. They can peel the top. They can squirt it in their mouth. And even with the ease at which they could consume the calories, it's still very difficult for these athletes to meet their energy expenditure. And so this is another thing that really piqued my interest with the Lewis and Clark expedition, because they didn't have access to these prepackaged processed items. And so even more amazing that they were able to accomplish what they did. So then I went through, and fortunately, some of these readings that I've done since I did this original presentation have confirmed what I had in here, and so I feel fairly comfortable sharing this with everybody. But it seems the primary rations, with what they had with them, barrels of salted pork, corn, flour, and then the portable soup, which definitely became very important as they crossed the Rocky Mountains. But I did note that did state that the pork was to be saved for times when there was no wild game. And then the rest was supplemental food. Okay, so basically, as I mentioned before, it was subsistence hunting. They were just getting what they needed when they could. So hunting, foraging, trade, and then reliant just on the game that was available depending on where they were as part of the journey. So deer, fish, beaver, buffalo, elk, antelope, bear, ducks, geese, dog, colts, so horse, seem to be the primary things that I've read that were available, and then just the edible roots and plants that they could find along the way to help offset just all the calories just coming from meat. And so you look at that and you think, okay, food's not that convenient, and then even when it is available, it's difficult to preserve, and so it can make eating in between meals difficult. So from what I could tell, there was one hot meal a day, and then leftovers were used for the other meals. And so, as I mentioned before, in comparison to these people who compete in these ultra endurance events these days, food is easily accessible. It's very portable. But back then, eating between meals may have been very difficult for the members of the expedition because food wasn't easily acceptable or accessible. And it does seem that once they got past the Mandan villages, I mean, even up to that point on the Missouri, it was mostly meat. And so I've read reports anywhere of 8 to 10 pounds of meat per person per day. And I know that there was an article in the journal that talked about this specifically in the We Proceeded On journal. So if you authored that article and you're on here, sorry I didn't really update it here. And so what I'm giving you are my predictions based off of kind of what I figured just digging around, looking at nutritional value. So roughly 400 pounds of meat from a buffalo, And of course, this is going to vary depending on the time of year that they shoot the animal. If it's early in the season, they may still be lean from the winter. Whereas if they find the same animal later in the season, the animal's probably much more fat and suitable for eating. And so we're looking at best case scenario with these. And then deer, not nearly as much meat. So roughly 4 deer to make up 1 buffalo. And so if they could get a buffalo, they could feed the party for a day, which is pretty wild. 2 elk or 4 deer, or a combination of an elk and a couple deer, but that was their primary food source. And so, yeah, that's makes it a little bit challenging. Sorry, we'll go back here. And so, but you can also see that was their primary food source, but maybe 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, depending on the type of meat. You're looking at different caloric values, but based off my calculations, I was like, okay, if they were able to consume 8 to 10 pounds of meat, that's only 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. And so if they've got a 7,000 calorie day, it's going to be really hard to fill in that gap just with meat. So I did, just based off, again, my limited knowledge here, just going through, I identified 3 periods that were likely very vigorous for the party. So initially, the initial journey up to the Mandan villages, where they still had the keel boat, especially the early spring with the thaw, the current going up against the current, and having to pull, as in POL, like pulling the boat, as well as pulling with ropes for periods of time, as well as paddling, especially with the amount of cargo that was loaded on the vessels. So that would have made for some difficult days. So definitely that would have been a period where there would have been days above that physical activity level of 5 or 5 times their basal metabolic rate. Then the Great Falls Portage, so the repeated trips up and down the falls as they were hauling equipment and supplies up, would have qualified for very vigorous physical activity. And then crossing through Lolo Pass and through the Rocky Mountains. So rough, cold. All of these had their own environmental challenges as well, which can contribute to caloric requirements. When it's hot, caloric intake can go up, which was definitely some heat here that they were dealing with. But then through the Rocky Mountains, now we're dealing with cold, which also presents challenges in increased caloric intake, as well as altitude. And altitude can have a double whammy, because high altitudes can also lead to a suppression of appetite, which may have been beneficial because they didn't have a lot of food to eat anyway. So in those times, just looking back at the data that we've talked about, even when food is plentiful, it can be challenging to consume so many calories in a day to maybe supply what was expended. And so, as I showed with the data from the other things, even though people are expending maybe above 5 times their basal metabolic rate, they may only be eating like 3, maybe 4 times their basal metabolic rate. And so that's going to lead to a deficit. And over time, that deficit is going to cause fatigue. And some of the reasons for the difficulty in that is, again, difficulty getting food. And even when food is abundant, time to prepare, the food's not convenient. The men need time to sleep. That's one of the biggest challenges when you see things like the Tour de France is they're trying to get enough sleep between each stage, and so a minimum of 8 to 10 hours. Well, that only leaves 14 to 16 hours to eat. And then trying to get that many calories in that small window, and then add in the time to prepare the food, and not having this prepackaged processed food option. To me, I look at that and think, wow, I imagine it was very difficult to be able to meet these needs during these especially during the high output periods. So ultimately that would result in a negative energy balance, which is going to lead to issues. And it does seem, just reading through the readings that I've gone through, that they would be forced into these recovery periods, where the men could rest and not work as hard. And then during those periods, if food was plentiful, then they could eat enough to be able to put back some of those calories, put themselves in a positive energy balance a little bit, and gain back some of that weight that they had lost, and some of that muscle mass, so that they could proceed on. And so it does seem like there were periods, especially going up the Missouri, that I read where they reported, and the men were just so fatigued they had to stop. And during those times, then they could replenish that negative energy balance and bring them back a little bit. Oh, one thing before I dive there. As far as like through the Rocky Mountains, talk about a negative energy balance. So from what I understand, this is where the portable soup became life-saving. However, the amount that they would get from the rations that they had wouldn't account to a lot of calories. And so I imagine during that 2-week period, they were on most days less than 1,000 calories of intake. And with the rugged terrain they were going over, you can start to see why, yeah, they were on the brink of starvation. They were in such a negative energy balance. That would have been an interesting set of data to see pre-post Bitterroot crossing weights on those guys, because I imagine you would have seen weight loss similar to what I reported earlier with the Antarctic crossing, but in a 2-week period. I imagine it was pretty drastic, because they probably didn't have a lot of energy. I'd imagine that they were moving a little bit slower than they could if they were well fed, but they were still high output, low intake, and that would have taken, as it did, a huge toll. So, conclusion, this whole journey was just an incredible nutritional feat, because even if these people, and I just put this because the federal government, this is what they recommend for a typical diet: 2,000 calories a day. So over the course of this journey, that'd be 1,800,000, so 1.8 million calories per person, just based off that. Which then for the permanent party, that's 58 million calories roughly. And they likely had to consume well above that amount. So just the sheer amount of food that was consumed to get over the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean is almost mind-boggling. And the fact that they did it under the conditions that they did, without modern packaging, without modern preservation, yeah, to me, that's really stuck with me about that. I mean, I will fret over every last detail just for an athlete that's going to run a marathon, and they had to put together an entire expedition, and of course, they wouldn't have been able to do it without the Native American tribes along the way. So they did have help, but very, very impressive. The more I think about it, the more amazed that I am that they were able to do what they did with what they had. So these are the primary books that I used when I was putting this together. The Food Journal of Lewis and Clark with recipes. I'm sure you've all seen it, but it's a fantastic book. I haven't made any of the recipes yet. Not sure if I'm going to venture into that, but that would be something, if you really wanted to relive a part of the journey, that would be essential reading. And of course, edited version of the journals. And then Undaunted Courage, this is still my favorite book that I've read all time. That's what really got me really interested and fired up about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And then finally, Jay had recommended this book to me, so I got a copy, and have been reading this recently as well, which is also a fascinating read. And then these are just a list of the scientific articles that I used. And with that, I'm happy to open the floor to discussion.